The area currently referred to as Jewish Waldheim in Forest Park is not one cemetery, but the site of over 250 separate cemeteries, now overseen by two caretaking organizations, Silverman and Weiss and Waldheim Cemetery Company. It is an incredibly important part of Chicago's immigrant story and continues to be a crucial area for genealogists and historians. If you want to learn more about the history of Jewish Waldheim, please see our other video, Jewish Waldheim Cemetery, Traditions of a Sacred Place. For this video, we're going to highlight some of the many fascinating and historically significant people buried in these cemeteries. This is only a small sampling. With over 175,000 graves, there are many more stories we could share, but then the video would be hours long. For privacy reasons, the caretakers have requested that we not film the burial sites. Instead, we have historical newspaper articles and images we can share. Let's learn more about some of the folks buried in Jewish Waldheim.
Have you ever heard of head walking? I hadn't until I came across a grave of Baptiste Goldket. He was born in 1879 and died in 1920. He was the inventor of the art of head walking. He did an equilibrist act with his brother Franconi. He bragged that he only once, had a slight injury because he was walking on his head down the 9 marble steps of the Paris Opera House on a wager. He said the marble steps were a little too hard for his skull, but he accomplished the feat and won the wager. He was from a circus family that had been in the circus for over 150 years in Europe. The last name might actually have been a stage name because they did a trick called the Golden Chain, and Goldket means gold chain. He was the inventor of head walking, as I mentioned, a circus acrobat, and he also, it was hard to tell if this is either his brother or his nephew, Jean Goldket, who was a very famous jazz and orchestra leader. Another well-known entertainer of his era was Ellis Glickman. He lived from 1869 to 1931. He was an actor, and he was the owner of the first Yiddish theater company in Chicago. And I have to say, once I started doing research, there are some really crazy stories about him and his career. When he was setting up his Yiddish stock company here in Chicago, there were producers in New York that tried to steal back his actors. And so he had to go back to New York and convince the 7 actors that he had originally contracted to tear up their contracts in New York and come back to Chicago. And he was successful. Another great story is in 1900, he was arrested and there was a near riot at his theater. His theater was part of a hall that was in the middle of a department store, and the owner of the department store desperately wanted the theater out of the building. Glickman had signed a lease to continue the theater in the hall, but the owner of the department store had offered the landlord more money, and he had assumed that they would be kicked out. Well, Ellis Glickman was very resourceful, and he started a campaign to keep them in the place. He would send actors in crazy costumes to parade in front of the department store, and he would take out signs in local stores pretending that the department store was selling cheap materials and cheap goods. He ended up being able to keep the actors in the hall, but he was fined $500 for having those actors parade in the grotesque costumes. And in 1901, a year later, there was an episode where the actors had literally jumped off of the stage to chase down a thief that was in the audience that one of the actors had recognized during the performance. Not only did the actors chase the thief down the street, but so did musicians chase along, the drummer leading the way apparently with his sticks. In 1903, Ellis Glickman was the first Jewish actor to play Shylock in an American production of that Shakespeare show. And in 1907, he sued the city because he said that he must be allowed to use movable scenery or he would face financial ruin. Apparently, there was a law at the time in Chicago theater that you couldn't use movable scenery. He died of heart disease at the age of 62. There are many heroes buried in Jewish Waldheim. Among them is Samuel Meisenberg. He was born in 1896 and he died in 1914. He was a Marine, and he was one of the first Americans to be killed in the American military landings at Veracruz, Mexico. He was also registered under the name of Samuel Martin, and I think we'll see that quite often with immigrants that come over to the United States. They came over with one name, and then sometimes they sort of Americanize their last name. So he went from Meisenberg to Martin. At the military landings in Veracruz, it was a military conflict in Mexico. The battle lasted for 20 days. This was at a time of strained relations between Mexico and the United States. When he died, there was a throng of people to pay respects. Over 5,000 people went to view his body in state, and several women were injured in the crush. A lot of women were fainting and screaming. Thousands lined the streets. The governor and both state senators attended the funeral, as well as the mayor of Chicago. And so did some Native Americans. Chief Alagala and his wife, and the wife of Chief Little Bear of Sioux Nation brought flowers to the funeral. So along with heroes, there are also some less than heroic folks buried in Jewish Waldheim. Albert Weinshanker, who also went by the last name of Weinshank, who lived from 1893 to 1929, was one of the victims of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. He was an organized crime figure. He was there in the garage when the firing occurred. What happened was that they were sent to this garage thinking that they were going to buy some cheap whiskey, and Capone gangsters showed up dressed as police officers. And so the gangsters that were already there, the Moran gang members, of which Weinshank was one, lined up because they knew that they would be bailed out and it didn't matter if they got arrested. And they didn't know that they were fake police officers and they were gunned down in that garage. Of course, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre has become infamous, and it drew national attention to Capone at the time. There are some folks buried here that had a huge impact on Chicago and the nation for movie palaces. You might have heard of Balaban and Katz. Balaban and Katz families were theater owners. They owned many theaters in the Chicago area, including the Chicago Theater and the Uptown Theater and the Riviera. The Chicago Theater, very famously designed by the architects of Cornelius and George Rapp, or Rapp and Rapp. They have a beautiful mausoleum here in Forest Home Cemetery that was designed by Rapp and Rapp. It was originally built for Ida Balaban Katz, who died at the age of 31 of tuberculosis. The Balaban Katz family, the Balaban family first started running a grocery store. They were doing okay, but then the matriarch of the family went to a local theater, and she saw how well they were doing business and said, why don't we go into the theater business? They started with a couple of small theaters, and then someone from the Balaban family had married someone from the Katz family, so they were in-laws, and then they went into business together. And they opened what was the first U.S. movie palace, which was the Central Park. It's still on Roosevelt Road here in Chicago, but it's now being used for religious ceremonies. It's like a church. That one was also designed by Rapp and Rapp. And then they opened many other theaters, like I said, the Riviera, the Tivoli, the Uptown, and of course the Chicago Theater on State. They were the first theaters to have air conditioning, and they treated the whole event of going to see a movie like a whole event. There were lavish stage shows. At one point, the Balaban and Katz family operated over 100 theaters in the Midwest. If you do come to visit the mausoleum, you'll notice that it's sort of in an Egyptian revival style. At the time that the mausoleum was built, that was about the time that King Tut's tomb had been rediscovered, and so the Egyptian style of architecture was a great craze at the time. Samuel Ridron, who was born in 1886 and died in 1915, was a hero of the Eastland disaster. He was on board of the Eastland when it sank in the Chicago River, and he saved over 40 people before drowning himself. He was an excellent swimmer, and in fact, he was going to be in charge of the swimming races at the picnic. So the Eastland, the boat was taking people to a company picnic, and he was the one organizing the swimming races. So I'm assuming that that's why he went to save so many people, because he was confident of his swimming skills. Unfortunately, it appears that he hit his head and he lost his life, still trying to save people. Did you know that a governor is buried here in Forest Park? Governor Sam Shapiro, who lived from 1907 to 1987, was a governor of Illinois. He first served as a state's attorney of Kankakee in 1936, and then he went to the Illinois State House of Representatives from 1947 to 61. And he had a very special interest in mental health issues. In 1960 and 1964, he was the lieutenant governor of Illinois. And he took office as the governor of Illinois in 1968 when the then current governor, Otto Kerner, resigned because he became to join the federal appellate court. So Samuel Shapiro, when he took the office of governor, was the second Jewish governor of Illinois. Illinois then became the first state to have 2 Jewish governors. He only served 1 year. He narrowly lost his bid to have a full term as governor to Richard Ogilvie. He served in the United States Navy during World War II, and the Kankakee Mental Health Center was renamed in his honor as the Samuel H. Shapiro Developmental Center.
Alan Harrisonburg was a very well-known talk radio host.
He was born in 1934 and died in 1984. He was sometimes called the last angry man. He had a very confrontational style when he was a radio host. He was very liberal, he was an atheist, and he was confrontational. He was murdered by members of the white supremacist group, The Order. The Order was a group that advocated for the killing of all Jews and advocated for sending blacks back to Africa. Alan passed the bar when he was 22. He was one of the youngest men to pass the bar at the time. He had a brain tumor that was able to be removed, but he very characteristically wore bangs the rest of his life to cover the scars from the surgery. He quit his law practice and he worked in a shoe store, and then he opened a clothing store in Denver. While he was running that store in Denver, he met a talk show host who got along with him and then started his radio career. At one point, his radio program was broadcast in more than 30 states. He was known for upsetting callers. He especially challenged racists, people who targeted blacks, leftists, and homosexuals. He targeted people that were racist against Hispanics and other minorities. He was shot while getting out of his Volkswagen at around 9:30 p.m. on June 18, 1984. He was shot 12 times, 5 of those times in his head. 2 of the killers were convicted of charges of federal civil rights violations, and they were sentenced to 190 and 242 years, respectively. There's a book about Berg, Talked to Death, The Life and Murder of Alan Berg by Stephen Singular. The play God's Country and the movies Betrayed and Brotherhood of Murder are based on the incident of Berg's murder. And the movie by Oliver Stone, Talk Radio, is also loosely based on him. Here's another person who's infamous, Samuel Nails Morton, from 1893 to 1923. He was a complicated fella. He was a mobster, a military hero, and he was cherished in the Jewish neighborhoods for a time because he very much protected the Jewish community. As a young man, Morton won the admiration of the Jewish community for making a part of Jewish west side of Chicago safe for Jews by creating a defense society to drive enemies away. His nickname, Nails, came from being tough in gang fights, and he was frequently in trouble with the law. He enlisted in World War I. In fact, the judge at the time said he was in trouble with the law, and the judge said, okay, you can either go to jail or you can go to the military. And he chose the military. He became a sergeant and then eventually a first lieutenant. He captured a machine gun nest even though he was injured. Once he came home, he became involved in bootlegging and boxing. He was a snappy dresser, and women were said to fight over him. He was written about in the papers as a mobster, and he continued to be known as someone who protected the Jewish community from what we would call Jew baiters. What's really interesting about Samuel Morton is the method of his death and the aftermath. So he was riding his horse through Lincoln Park when he was thrown, and the horse in its panic kicked him in the head and killed Samuel Nails Morton. His buddies, his gangster buddies, wanted to follow in a tradition of what you would do when a comrade is killed, and they went and they shot that horse, that poor innocent horse. This story is included in the movie Public Enemy with James Cagney. Max Malini, born in 1873, and he lived until 1942, was called the Napoleon of Magic. He was an accomplished magician who performed for U.S. presidents, Warren Harding and Theodore Roosevelt, as well as celebrities like Al Capone and John D. Rockefeller, and he even performed at Buckingham Palace. He was a slight man who had very small hands, and so it was very surprising to people that how well he was able to do magic. His best trick was borrowing someone's hat and attempting to perform a coin trick, which failed. But then he would finish the trick by lifting the hat to reveal a block of ice that could barely fit in the hat. Another routine that he would do is he would be blindfolded in front of a table with cards spread out. An audience member would call out a card, and he would blankly stab the table with a knife and pull up the card that the audience member had asked for. There is a show about him. There's another magician named Paul Daniels who produced a show about him called The Magic of Max Malini. In Chicago, if you say to some people of a certain age, "Where's the beef?" they will remember Clara Peller. She was a very diminutive woman, standing at just a little bit over 4'11", and she worked for 35 years as a manicurist. And one time she was working as a manicurist on a commercial TV set, and the agency loved her. She had a very no-nonsense manner and a very characteristic voice, and she was signed to a contract. So her first ad was for a Massachusetts lottery as a comical cleaning lady. But when she started to make commercials for Wendy's, it's when she really hit the big time. And her tagline, "Where's the beef?" was incredibly popular. Reportedly, poor Clara was a little bit hard of hearing and she couldn't hear her cue on set. So they would have a cast member hide on the floor and they would poke Clara on her foot when it was time for her to say her lines. And if you go back and look at those old ads, it kind of makes sense for the way that she's delivering those lines, as though she's crying out in surprise. She made increasingly more money. She started off being paid not very well, but then eventually Wendy's claimed that she was paid over $500,000 for her commercials. She was let go from Wendy's because she ended up making a Prego commercial, the spaghetti sauce company. And the commercial for Prego, she says, "I found it. I found the beef." And Wendy's was a little ticked off about that, and they let her go. Well, she got the last laugh because Wendy's sales slumped for an entire 5 years after they let Clara go. Clara died 1 week after turning 85. There was a musical written about her by her daughter called Clara and the Beef, and it was based on the biography that her daughter wrote, Clara Peller, an American icon. Probably the most well-known celebrity buried in Jewish Waldheim would be Michael Todd. Michael Todd lived from 1909 to 1958 and was very well known for being Elizabeth Taylor's husband. He is the only husband that Elizabeth Taylor did not divorce. He was born Avram Hirsch Goldwagen. He was a producer. He produced 17 Broadway shows and also produced movies, most famously Around the World in 80 Days, which won the Best Picture Oscar in 1956. He also developed the widescreen format, which is called Todd A.O., and he owned a bunch of theaters. The Harrison Selland Theater in Chicago was owned by Michael Todd. He married Elizabeth Taylor, and Elizabeth Taylor actually converted to Judaism for him. Tragically, he died in a plane crash. The plane was ironically called the Lucky Liz. Elizabeth Taylor was supposed to be on that plane with Michael, but he had asked her not to fly on the plane because she was sick with the flu. Liz would come out to visit the grave every year. They talked about her putting roses on the grave, and she was quite often seen at local establishment drinking a toast when visiting his grave. There's another story that what happened in the grave was robbed. So grave robbers, nearly 20 years after he was buried, someone noticed that the grave had been dug up and was empty. Grave robbers had mistakenly believed that Elizabeth Taylor had buried Michael Todd with a very expensive ring. Unfortunately, Michael Todd's remains, there was not a lot of remains from the plane accident, and there certainly wasn't an expensive ring. Luckily, the remains were found and reburied. Eddie Schwartz, also called Chicago Ed, was a late-night DJ. He lived from 1946 to 2009. The story goes that his voice was meant for silent films. He had a very characteristic voice, but he loved Chicago and he cared for the downtrodden. Like I said, he was called Chicago Ed, and he worked at several Chicago radio stations. Probably his largest audience was during his 10 years at WGN. In 1992, he walked out on a salary dispute and then moved to WLUP-FM. He championed the causes of regular Joes. In 1980, he successfully lobbied the Chicago City Council to raise the minimum nighttime temperature in rental apartments to 63 degrees from 55. I can't imagine it being 55 degrees. So thank you, Chicago Ed. He also started the Good Neighbor Food Drive. Each year, the drive collected thousands of dollars and thousands of pounds of food for the area's food pantries. After he left radio, he continued to write columns for the Lerner newspaper chain and letters to the editor. He died of complications from kidney disease. Sometimes when you're cutting through Jewish Waldheim, if you live in Forest Park, you quite often cut through the graveyard. You are driving on Greenberg Avenue. That is named after Alex Lewis Greenberg. He lived from 1891 to 1955. Alex Lewis Greenberg was reportedly the financial brains of Al Capone's gang. He lived from 1891 to 1955. He arrived in America when he was 12 and at one time ran a restaurant on Coney Island. He then moved to Chicago at the age of 16, where he opened a saloon and then went into the loan business. He also owned a share of the Manhattan Brewery after its owner was shot dead. He then later changed the name of that brewery to the Canadian Ice Brewing. He thought Manhattan sounded like a bad name. Greenberg was a government witness in a 1943 trial against Capone gangsters who were on trial for extorting money from the motion picture business. During that trial, he was threatened, and one of the accused said to him, "We'll take care of you." 12 years later, in 1955, he was gunned down as he left a South Side restaurant. Another of the government witnesses in that same trial was assassinated by a bomb in his car. There used to be a chapel in the honor of Alex Louis Greenberg, but it was torn down because of its decrepit condition.
We here at the Historical Society of Forest Park thank you for watching and taking the time to learn about some of the incredible history here in Forest Park, Illinois.